The moment my wife replaced me with my own employee, was the moment everyone in that room decided I was finished. I remember exactly how the air felt, too cold, too still, like the building itself was holding its breath waiting for something to break. It was supposed to be a routine executive meeting, something I had done 100 times before without thinking, something I had built my entire life around. The same conference room. The same long glass table. The same city skyline stretching across the floor-to-ceiling windows like a promise I had already kept. But that day, everything was different, even before she walked in. Emily didn't sit next to me like she always did. She didn't even look at me. She walked straight to the head of the table, heels clicking against the polished floor like she belonged somewhere I didn't anymore. And behind her, was Ryan. My employee. The guy I hired 2 years ago straight out of a mediocre resume and a confident smile. The guy I trained. The guy I trusted. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The way he stood there, relaxed, almost comfortable in a space he had no right to claim, said everything. I could feel the shift immediately. The room had already chosen sides before I even understood there was a side to choose. We need to make this quick, Emily said, her voice calm, controlled, like she was discussing quarterly numbers instead of dismantling a life. She slid a folder across the table toward me. Clean. Precise. Final. I didn't open it right away. I didn't need to. I already knew. Divorce papers. Not at home. Not in private. Not with any attempt at respect or decency. No, she chose this room. This audience. This moment. Because this wasn't just an ending. It was a performance. A statement. I looked at her, really looked at her, searching for something familiar, something that reminded me of the woman who once told me we were building this together. There was nothing. Just calculation. You're not enough anymore, Daniel, she said, like she had rehearsed it. Not angry. Not emotional. Just, certain. The kind of certainty that doesn't come from impulse. It comes from planning. From alignment. From someone standing behind you, making you believe you've already won. I didn't react. That's what people always misunderstand about moments like that. They expect shouting. They expect confrontation. They expect something loud enough to justify the tension they feel. But I've learned something over the years. Silence makes people comfortable. It makes them underestimate you. And Emily, she needed me to react. She needed me to look small. Ryan shifted slightly behind her, just enough to catch my attention. His hand rested casually on the back of her chair, like it had already become his place. That was the part that landed. Not the papers. Not the words. That small, effortless gesture. Ownership without permission. Confidence without earning it. I glanced around the table. Faces I recognized. People who had watched me build everything from nothing. People who had sat in those same seats when this company was just an idea scribbled on legal pads and late-night coffee runs. None of them said anything. Some avoided eye contact. Others watched carefully, like this was just another business decision unfolding in real time. That's when it clicked. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't emotional. This was coordinated. Layered. Executed. Emily didn't just decide to leave me. She decided to replace me. And Ryan, he didn't just step in. He stepped up into something he thought he understood. You can sign now, or we can handle it another way, she added, tapping the folder lightly like she was offering me a choice that didn't really exist. I let out a slow breath and leaned back in my chair. Not defensive. Not defeated. Just, observant. Because in that moment, while everyone in that room believed they were watching the end of my story, I realized something else entirely. They weren't watching me lose. They were watching themselves walk into something they didn't understand. something they never thought to question. And the best part? Emily had no idea. Ryan had no idea. None of them did. Because what they saw sitting in that chair was a man being replaced. What they didn't see was who actually owned the seat they were so eager to take. I did not build that company in a day, and I definitely did not build it for someone like Ryan to sit in my chair and pretend he understood it. What most people saw when they walked into that office was a mid-sized logistics firm with steady contracts, clean numbers, and predictable growth, but that was only the surface, the version I allowed people to see because it made everything easier to manage. Emily used to say she loved how stable everything felt, how I always knew where the business was going even when the market shifted, and I remember thinking that meant she understood me, that she respected the years I spent working 12, sometimes 14 hours a day to make sure we never had to worry about anything. Back when we first got married, we lived in a small apartment that barely had enough space for a real dining table, and I used an old desk pushed against the wall as both my office and our kitchen counter, sketching out expansion plans while she sat across from me scrolling through listings of houses we could not yet afford. She believed in the future I was building, or at least I thought she did. That was before the numbers got bigger, before the contracts started coming in from companies that did not even know my name, before the structure behind everything became more complex than she ever cared to ask about. Ryan came in much later, at a point when the company already had momentum, when most of the hardest decisions had already been made, when the risks had already been taken. He showed up with confidence, quick answers, and just enough charm to make people feel like he belonged in rooms he had never earned his way into. I remember Emily mentioning him at dinner once, saying he had potential, saying he reminded her of someone who could go far if given the right opportunity. I did not think much of it at the time because I was the one giving him that opportunity. I was the one signing off on his promotions, approving his projects, trusting him with pieces of a system he only understood in fragments. What I did not see, or maybe what I chose not to see, was how often his name started appearing in conversations that had nothing to do with work. Late nights that were explained as extended meetings, messages that were brushed off as coordination, subtle changes in tone when she talked about the company like she was observing it from a distance instead of living inside it with me. It is easy to miss those details when you are focused on growth, when you believe the people closest to you are aligned with the same vision. I thought I was building something for us, something that would give us options, freedom, a life that did not depend on anyone else's approval. Emily started talking differently around that time, less about what we were building and more about what she thought we lacked. She compared timelines, lifestyles, other people's success, always framed as concern but always landing like a quiet criticism. Ryan's name kept coming up, not directly at first, but always somewhere in the background, like a reference point I did not realize I was being measured against. And the more I think about it now, the more I realize that by the time she walked into that conference room with those papers in her hand, she had already made her decision long before that day. The meeting was not the beginning of anything. It was the final step of something that had been unfolding right in front of me while I was busy making sure everything else stayed in place. What she saw was a man who worked too much, who stayed behind the scenes, who did not need recognition to keep things running. What she did not understand was that the version of me she was judging was only one layer of a structure she had never taken the time to look beyond. And that is the part that changes everything, because while she was evaluating what she thought I was worth, she never once asked who was actually holding everything together behind the scenes, and by the time that question mattered, it was already too late. It did not happen all at once, and that is what made it dangerous, because when betrayal comes in pieces, it feels like normal change until it is too late to question it. At first, it was small things, things easy to dismiss if you are focused on keeping everything else running smoothly. Emily started staying out later, saying there were client dinners, networking events, opportunities we could not afford to miss, and I believed her because that is what growth looks like from the outside: more meetings, more conversations, more time spent building connections. But then the details stopped lining up. The same events would come up again in slightly different ways, timelines that shifted just enough to feel off, explanations that sounded practiced instead of natural. I noticed it, of course I did, but I told myself it was nothing because I trusted her and because I had more important things to deal with, or at least that is what I convinced myself. Ryan's role in the company began to expand around the same time, faster than it should have, faster than anyone else would have allowed if they understood how the internal structure actually worked. He started showing up in meetings he was not scheduled for, offering opinions on decisions that were not within his responsibility, and people listened to him, not because he had earned that position, but because he spoke like someone who believed he already had it. I watched it happen without interrupting because observation has always been more valuable to me than reaction. Emily began to reference him more openly, not just as an employee but as someone whose perspective she valued, someone she claimed understood the direction the company needed to take. That was the first time I heard her say something that stayed with me longer than it should have. She said that some people were better at seeing opportunities because they were not stuck in old ways of thinking. She did not say my name, but she did not need to. The message was clear. What I had built was starting to look outdated in her eyes, and Ryan represented something she believed was more aligned with where she wanted to go. The conversations at home changed after that. They became less about what we were doing together and more about what she thought I was not doing fast enough. She questioned decisions I had already made, criticized strategies she had never fully understood, and compared outcomes to hypothetical scenarios that only existed because she assumed she had better information than I did. I let her talk because arguing would not have changed anything, and because I was starting to see a pattern that mattered more than any single conversation. It was not just disagreement. It was positioning. She was slowly rewriting the narrative of who I was in relation to the company, shifting me from the person who built it to someone who was holding it back. And Ryan was always there, just outside the center of the conversation, reinforcing that shift without ever making it obvious. Then came the moments that were harder to ignore. Messages that stopped when I entered the room. Calls that ended too quickly. A kind of silence that felt deliberate instead of natural. One evening, I walked into the living room and saw her sitting with her phone angled away from me, her expression focused in a way I had not seen before, and when she noticed me, she smiled just a little too quickly, like she had practiced that reaction without realizing it. I did not ask who she was talking to because I already knew. What mattered was not the confirmation. What mattered was what it meant. The more I watched, the clearer it became that this was no longer just about personal betrayal. It was strategic. Ryan was not just stepping into a relationship. He was stepping into a position. And Emily was not just choosing him. She was aligning herself with what she believed was a better version of the future. The problem was that both of them were making that decision based on a version of reality that only existed on the surface. They saw titles. They saw visibility. They saw control in the most obvious places. What they did not see was everything underneath that made those visible positions possible in the first place. And that is where they made their biggest mistake, because while they were focused on replacing me in the role they understood, they never once questioned whether that role was the one that actually mattered. The shift stopped being subtle the night they decided to make it public, because there is a difference between betrayal that hides in the background and betrayal that wants an audience. It was supposed to be a company celebration, something about hitting a new revenue milestone, the kind of event that usually felt like a reflection of years of work finally paying off. I almost did not go. Not because I was busy, but because something about the way the invitation was worded felt off, like I was being included out of obligation rather than intention. Still, I showed up, because walking away too early would have given them exactly what they wanted, confirmation that I was already out of place in something I built. The venue was one of those downtown rooftop spaces, glass railings, city lights stretching for miles, the kind of place people choose when they want success to feel visible. I walked in and immediately felt it again, that same shift from the conference room, only this time it was louder, more confident, more certain. Conversations slowed just slightly when I passed by. Not stopped, just adjusted, like people were recalibrating how to include me in a reality that had already changed. Emily was at the center of it all, exactly where she liked to be, dressed in a way that made sure every eye in the room would land on her at least once. And Ryan was right next to her, not behind her anymore, not waiting, but standing beside her like they had already become a unit people were expected to accept. I watched them for a moment before walking over, not rushing, not hesitating, just observing. That was when I noticed how comfortable he had become, how easily he leaned into conversations that used to require experience he did not have, how naturally he spoke about the company like it was already his to shape. Emily saw me first, and for a second, something crossed her face, not guilt, not hesitation, just a brief calculation before she smiled. "Daniel," she said, like we were meeting at a networking event instead of standing inside the life we built together. Ryan nodded at me, casual, controlled, like he was acknowledging someone at his level. That was new. "We were just talking about the next phase of expansion," Emily added, her tone light but deliberate. "Ryan has some really strong ideas." I let that sit for a second, not because I needed to process it, but because I wanted to see how far they were willing to go with the performance. "I am sure he does," I said, keeping my voice even, neutral, giving them nothing to push against. The conversation around us continued, but the space between the three of us tightened, like everyone nearby could feel something was about to happen even if they did not understand what. Emily glanced at Ryan, a quick look that said more than anything she had said out loud all night, and then she turned back to me with that same calm certainty I had seen in the conference room. "Actually," she said, lifting her glass slightly like she was about to make a toast, "there is something we should probably be clear about." That was the moment. Not private. Not careful. Public. Intentional. She stepped slightly closer to Ryan, closing whatever space had been left between them, and the message landed exactly the way she wanted it to. A few conversations nearby went quiet. People started paying attention. "Things are changing," she continued, her voice carrying just enough to draw a wider audience without sounding like she was trying. "For the company. For me." She did not rush it. She wanted every word to land. "And I think it is better if everyone understands that moving forward, Ryan is going to be taking on a much bigger role." There it was. Not just a promotion. Not just a shift. A replacement framed as progress. I could feel eyes on me now, waiting, measuring, expecting some kind of reaction that would confirm the version of the story they were already starting to believe. Emily held my gaze, steady, confident, like she had already accounted for every possible outcome. Ryan stayed quiet, but the way he stood there, the way he did not correct anything, did not step back, told me everything I needed to know. This was not just her decision. It was theirs. And in that moment, surrounded by people who thought they were watching a man get pushed out of his own company, I realized something that mattered more than anything they were trying to prove. They were not just humiliating me. They were locking themselves into a version of reality they could not undo. Because what they were claiming in front of everyone that night, what they were so confident about, what they believed gave them power, was built on an assumption so basic, so incomplete, that they never once thought to question it. And that assumption was about to cost them everything. I did not stay long after that moment, not because I felt pushed out, but because I understood something they did not, something that made everything happening around me feel temporary, almost insignificant compared to what was actually in motion beneath the surface. I set my glass down, nodded once like I had just been given information I would consider later, and walked away without giving them the reaction they were expecting. That was the part people always misread. They think silence means defeat. They think walking away means surrender. But what they never understand is that the person who reacts emotionally is the one who has already lost control of the situation. And I was not interested in losing control, not now, not after everything I had built. The ride home was quiet, but not heavy. There was no anger, no desperation, no need to replay the scene in my head looking for something I could have done differently. That phase had already passed. By the time things become public like that, the outcome has already been decided by the people involved, and the only question left is whether you understand the full picture or you are still reacting to the version they want you to see. When I walked into the apartment, the space felt different, not empty, not yet, but already shifting towards something final. A few things were missing, small enough that most people would not notice, but I did. The way her shoes were no longer by the door. The way the bathroom counter looked cleaner than usual. The way the closet felt slightly uneven, like part of it had already been cleared out in advance. She had been preparing for this longer than I realized. I took off my jacket, placed it on the back of the chair, and stood there for a moment, just taking it in. This was supposed to be the place we built together, the space that reflected everything we worked for, and now it felt like a transition point, something temporary that had already served its purpose. My phone buzzed once on the counter. A message from Emily. Short. Direct. We need to finalize. Everything soon. No emotion. No explanation. Just logistics. That told me everything I needed to know about where her priorities were. I did not respond. Not because I did not have something to say, but because anything I said at that point would only reinforce the version of the situation she believed was already settled. Instead, I walked into my office, the one room in the apartment that still felt completely untouched, and sat down at the desk where most of the real decisions had always been made. People like Ryan thought the company existed in conference rooms and presentations, in titles and visibility, in the parts of the business that could be seen and measured easily. But the real structure, the part that actually determined who had control, lived in places like this, in documents, agreements, and layers that were never meant to be obvious. I opened my laptop, not to check emails or review reports, but to look at something I had not needed to revisit in a long time. A structure I had put in place years ago, back when the company was still small enough that people assumed every decision was simple. Back when I learned that the only way to protect something valuable was to separate what people saw from what actually mattered. The files were exactly where I left them. Organized. Quiet. Unnoticed by anyone who did not know what they were looking at. I scrolled through them slowly, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because I wanted to remind myself of one thing. This was never just a single company. It was never just one operation that could be taken over by replacing a person in a visible role. It was a network. A structure designed to function regardless of who stood at the front of it. And at the center of that structure, in a position no one had questioned because no one had ever thought to look that far, was me. That was the part Emily never understood. She thought she was leaving a man who worked too much, who stayed behind the scenes, who did not fight for recognition. She thought she was choosing someone more visible, more assertive, someone who looked like he was moving faster towards something bigger. Ryan thought he was stepping into a leadership role, into a position that gave him control over something he had only seen from the inside out. What neither of them realized was that everything they were so confident about existed within a system they did not control, a system they had never even questioned. And as I sat there in that quiet room, looking at the structure they believed they had outgrown, I understood exactly how this was going to play out. Not with noise. Not with confrontation. But with timing. Because the moment they tried to act on the power they thought they had just gained, that was the moment they were going to find out who actually owned the ground they were standing on. The next morning, nothing exploded, nothing dramatic happened, and that was exactly how I knew everything was about to shift in a way they could not predict, because real power never announces itself, it moves quietly until the moment it cannot be ignored anymore. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, not because I needed to, but because timing matters when you understand how systems actually operate, and I wanted to be there before the version of reality they were building had a chance to settle into something people accepted as normal. The building looked the same from the outside, glass reflecting the early morning light, employees walking in with coffee in hand, completely unaware that the structure they depended on was about to remind them where the real authority came from. Inside, things felt different. Subtle, but noticeable. Conversations paused when I walked past. A few people nodded, unsure of how to position themselves now that the narrative had shifted. That is the thing about perception, it moves faster than truth, but it does not last as long. I made my way to my office, the one space that had not been reassigned yet, the one place they had not touched because they were still figuring out how far they could go without exposing what they did not understand. My assistant looked at me with a mix of confusion and caution, like she had been given new instructions but had not yet decided whether to follow them. "Good morning, Daniel," she said carefully. I nodded once, calm, steady, the same way I always had. "Has the board confirmed attendance for today?" I asked. She hesitated for half a second, just enough to tell me that something had already been communicated without including me directly. "There is a meeting scheduled later," she said. "Ryan is leading it." I almost smiled, not because it was surprising, but because it confirmed exactly what I expected. They were moving fast, trying to solidify control before anyone had time to question it, trying to create a new normal before the old one had a chance to reassert itself. "Good," I said simply, and walked into my office. I did not sit down right away. Instead, I looked out over the floor, at the people who believed they understood how everything worked, at the layers of operation that functioned smoothly because they were designed to, not because of who was currently visible at the top. Then I closed the door and picked up my phone. One call. That was all it took. Not to someone inside the company. Not to anyone Ryan or Emily would think to contact. This call went higher, beyond the level they had ever interacted with, to a part of the structure they had never seen because they never asked the right questions. "This is Daniel Foster," I said when the line connected. "No introduction needed. No explanation required. It is time to activate the review." There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, just acknowledgement. "Understood," the voice replied. "We will initiate immediately." I ended the call and set the phone down. That was it. No confrontation. No warning. Just a shift in motion that would begin to reveal everything they had overlooked. Because what Emily and Ryan did not know, what they never thought to consider, was that the company they were trying to take over was not the top of the structure. It was a layer, a visible piece of something much larger, something designed with safeguards, oversight, and control points that could not be bypassed just by replacing a person in a leadership role. Years ago, when the company started to grow beyond what most people could manage, I made a decision that very few people ever fully understood. I separated ownership from operation. I built a parent structure that held everything together, a framework that ensured no single individual, no matter how confident or aggressive, could assume control without passing through the mechanisms that governed the entire system. And I positioned myself where those mechanisms converged. Not in a way that drew attention. Not in a way that needed to be explained. Just quietly, effectively, permanently. Ryan thought he was stepping into leadership. Emily thought she was aligning herself with someone who represented upward movement. What they were actually doing was stepping into a controlled environment with rules they had never seen, rules that did not care about perception, confidence, or public declarations. Rules that only responded to one thing. Authority. And as the morning moved forward, as emails began to circulate, as notifications started appearing in inboxes across departments, I could already see the first signs of that shift taking hold. Meetings being flagged. Approvals being paused. Requests being rerouted through channels that had always existed but were now being enforced with precision. It was subtle at first, almost invisible to anyone who did not understand what they were looking at. But I did. Because I built it. And by the time Ryan walked into that meeting later that day, ready to prove he belonged in a role he thought he had claimed, the system he believed he was controlling was already responding to someone else entirely. Someone he never realized he was answering to. By the time the meeting was about to start, the atmosphere inside the building had already shifted in ways most people could not explain but could definitely feel, like something beneath the surface had started moving and no one knew exactly why. I did not go straight to the conference room. There was no reason to rush, because timing is not about being early, it is about arriving when the moment matters most. Instead, I stayed in my office, watching how the system responded, watching the subtle signals ripple through departments that had always operated smoothly until now. Emails were being flagged for additional authorization. Financial approvals were being redirected. Access Permissions that had always been taken for granted were suddenly requiring verification. None of it was loud. None of it caused panic. But it created friction, just enough to slow everything down and force people to notice that something was different. That was the first layer. The kind that makes people uncomfortable without giving them something concrete to point at. My phone buzzed once. A message from one of the senior compliance officers, someone who did not report to anyone inside the company structure Ryan thought he was leading. Review process initiated. Board presence confirmed. I read it once and set the phone down. That was all I needed. The stage was ready. When I finally walked toward the conference room, the hallway felt quieter than usual, conversations lower, movements more deliberate. People had started to sense that whatever shift had begun was not random. It had direction. It had intent. And it was not coming from where they expected. I reached the door just as voices inside rose slightly, not in conflict, but in confusion. I did not go in immediately. I paused for a second, just long enough to listen. Ryan was speaking, confident, steady, presenting something about restructuring leadership, outlining changes that assumed authority he believed was already his. Emily's voice followed, reinforcing his points, framing everything as a natural evolution, a necessary step forward. They sounded convincing. To anyone who did not know better, it would have felt like control. That was the illusion they were relying on. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room shifted instantly. Not dramatically, not with shock, but with that same subtle recalibration I had been seeing all morning. People turned. Some straightened in their seats. Others avoided eye contact. Ryan stopped mid-sentence for just a fraction of a second before continuing, trying to maintain the rhythm he had established. Emily looked at me, and for the first time since all of this started, there was something different in her expression. Not fear. Not yet. But uncertainty. Small, controlled, but there. I did not interrupt. I did not take a seat right away. I just stood there. Listening, letting them finish what they had started, because the most effective moment is not when you cut someone off, it is when you let them fully commit to the position they cannot defend. Ryan moved through his presentation, outlining decisions that required approvals he had not actually secured, referencing authority that had not been formally recognized, building a structure of control based entirely on the assumption that no one would challenge him. When he finished, there was a pause. Not applause. Not agreement. Just a pause, the kind that waits for something else to happen. That was when the door behind me opened again. Two individuals stepped in, both dressed in a way that made it clear they were not part of the internal team. They did not look around. They did not hesitate. They walked straight to the table and placed a set of documents down in front of the board members. The room changed again, more noticeably this time. Confusion turned into focus. Attention shifted away from Ryan, away from Emily, toward the new presence that had just entered without asking for permission. One of them spoke, calm, professional, precise. We are here to conduct a formal operational and ownership review under the authority of the parent group. That sentence landed heavier than anything that had been said all morning. Ryan frowned slightly, trying to process it. There must be some mistake, he said, his confidence tightening just enough to reveal the strain underneath. I am leading this transition. The man did not argue. He simply looked at him for a moment, then shifted his attention to the board. All current leadership actions are subject to verification, he continued. Until the review is complete, no structural changes can be enacted without direct authorization. Emily's gaze moved from the documents to me, slowly, like she was connecting something she should have realized earlier. I met her eyes, calm, steady, the same way I had from the beginning. And in that moment, as the room adjusted once again, as the narrative they had built started to crack under pressure they did not understand, I knew exactly where this was going next. Because this was no longer about perception. This was about control. And for the first time since they decided to make their move, they were finally standing inside the part of the system they never knew existed. The silence that followed was not confusion anymore, it was recognition, the kind that spread slowly across a room when people realize the situation they thought they understood has just shifted beyond their control. No one spoke right away. No one moved. The weight of what had just been introduced settled in, pressing against every assumption that had been made up until that point. Ryan was the first to try to recover. He straightened slightly, adjusting his posture like confidence alone could restore authority. "We can address whatever review you need," he said, his voice measured but tighter now, "but it does not change the fact that I am leading this transition." The man from the parent group did not respond immediately. He simply opened the folder in front of him and slid a document across the table toward the board. "Leadership designation is not determined by internal declaration," he said calmly. "It is defined by ownership structure." That word landed harder than anything else. Ownership. It shifted the entire frame of the conversation. Ryan's eyes moved quickly over the document, scanning, searching for something familiar, something that would confirm his position, but the longer he looked, the more his expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough to show that what he expected to see was not there. Emily leaned in slightly, her attention locked on the same pages, her confidence beginning to fracture in small, controlled ways. "This does not make sense," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. "It does," the man replied, still calm, still precise. "The entity you are attempting to restructure operates under a parent organization. All authority flows from that structure." I stepped forward then, finally closing the distance between myself and the table, not in a rush, not with force, just with certainty. Every movement measured. Every step deliberate. The room adjusted again, but this time it was different. This time it was not about perception. It was about alignment. I took a seat, not at the edge, not as an observer, but at the position that had always been mine, whether they recognized it or not. Ryan looked at me, really looked this time, like he was seeing something he had missed before. "Daniel," he said, his voice carrying a question he was not ready to ask directly. I did not answer right away. I let the moment stretch, let the silence do what it always does when people start to understand they have miscalculated something fundamental. Then I reached forward, turned the document slightly so it faced them more clearly, and tapped one section with my finger. Not aggressively. Just enough to guide their attention. "You should read that part carefully," I said. Emily's eyes followed the motion. Ryan leaned in again. And that was when it finally landed. The name. Not as an employee. Not as an executive. Not as someone within the structure they thought they controlled. But at the level above it. At the point where decisions were not suggested, but defined. The realization did not come all at once. It moved through them in layers. First confusion. Then recognition. Then something heavier. Something closer to understanding. "That is not possible," Ryan said under his breath, but there was no confidence left in it, only resistance. The man from the parent group spoke again, confirming what they were already starting to see. "All major operational entities are governed by this structure," he said. "And all final authority rests with the designated owner." He paused just long enough for the next part to settle fully. "Mr. Foster." The room did not react loudly. It did not need to. The shift was complete. Everything they had built their assumption on, everything they believed gave them control, collapsed into something much smaller than they ever imagined. Emily's gaze locked onto me, searching for something, maybe an explanation, maybe a denial, maybe anything that would make this align with the version of reality she had committed to. But there was nothing to explain. It had always been there. She had just never asked the right questions. Ryan leaned back slightly, the posture he had carried all morning. Finally breaking, replaced by something he could not fully hide. Not panic. Not yet. But the beginning of it. The realization that he had stepped into a position that never belonged to him, inside a system that was never his to control. I leaned back in my chair, calm, steady, exactly as I had been from the beginning. You thought you replaced me, I said quietly, not for the room, not for the board, but for them. But you never understood what I actually was. And in that moment, with every eye in the room now focused on a truth they could no longer ignore, the reversal was no longer a possibility. It was already happening. No one argued after that, not because they agreed, but because there was nothing left to argue with, the kind of silence that follows when a reality collapses and there is no version of it left to defend. The document stayed on the table, open, undeniable, outlining a structure that did not bend to confidence or assumptions, only to authority that had been established long before any of them thought to question it. Ryan looked down at the pages again, slower this time, like reading them differently might change what they meant, but the outcome was already set. The role he thought he had claimed was never available in the way he believed, and the position he tried to step into existed within boundaries he had never even considered. Emily did not speak right away. Her focus stayed on me, searching for something that could reconcile the version of me she had dismissed with the one sitting in front of her now. It was not anger in her expression. It was something more complicated, something closer to realization, the kind that arrives too late to change anything. The man from the parent group began gathering the documents, his movements calm, procedural, like this outcome had always been expected. All leadership changes are suspended pending review, he said, his voice steady, final. Current authority remains unchanged. That was the formal version of what had just happened. The structure reasserting itself. The system correcting the assumption. Ryan leaned back further in his chair, the confidence he carried into the room replaced by something quieter, something uncertain. He glanced at Emily, then back at me, like he was trying to understand where the mistake had been made, but the mistake was not a single decision, it was the foundation he built those decisions on. Emily finally spoke, her voice lower than before, controlled but no longer certain. You never told me, she said. It was not an accusation. It was a statement shaped by hindsight. I met her gaze without hesitation. You never asked, I replied. There was no need to say more than that. Everything else was already clear. The room remained still for a few seconds longer, not out of tension, but because people were recalibrating, adjusting their understanding of who held authority, who they needed to align with, who actually determined what happened next. That is how power works in rooms like that. It does not need to announce itself loudly. It reveals itself once, and then everyone adjusts accordingly. I stood up slowly, not to claim anything, not to reinforce what had already been established, but because there was nothing left for me to do there. The outcome was set. The system would continue its process. The review would move forward. Whatever consequences followed would not require my presence to unfold. Ryan watched me as I stepped away from the table, his expression still trying to reconcile the gap between what he thought he understood and what had just been revealed. Emily did not look away this time. She held my gaze as long as she could, like she was trying to find a version of the past that made sense in light of the present, but there was no version that aligned anymore. That is the cost of assumptions. By the time you realize what you misunderstood, the outcome has already been decided. I walked toward the door, the same way I had walked into the room, calm, measured, without urgency. As I reached the hallway, the noise of the office returned slowly, conversations picking back up, movement resuming, but with a different tone, a different awareness. People knew something had changed, even if they did not know every detail. And that was enough. I did not go back to my office right away. Instead, I kept walking, past the glass walls, past the workstations, past the layers of operation that would continue to function exactly as they were designed to. Because in the end, that was the only thing that mattered. Not the titles. Not the positions people thought they held. But the structure underneath it all. When I stepped outside, the air felt clearer, not because anything had been resolved emotionally, but because everything had been clarified structurally. Emily had made her choice based on what she thought was visible. Ryan had stepped forward based on what he thought was available. And both of them had built their decisions on a version of reality that did not include the part that actually mattered. I did not look back at the building. There was no reason to. What I built was not something that depended on where I stood physically. It existed in a system that would continue to operate regardless of who tried to take a visible position within it. And as I walked away, there was no need for confrontation, no need for final words, no need for anything beyond what had already been shown. Because the truth had already done what it needed to do. It did not need to be repeated. It did not need to be explained. It only needed to be seen once. And after that, everything else falls into place exactly the way it was always meant to. Thanks for staying till the end. This story isn't over yet. Subscribe, like, and share to see what happens next.